Here. Okay, awesome. Welcome everybody. We're going to talk about Matthew 22. Uh, and I just mentioned, uh, I don't think we're going to be here that long because I think this chapter is pretty straightforward. But every time I say that, it seems like we're here very long. So we're going to dive in. And I'm going to start with the first 14 chapters. So I'll read it. It starts, and again, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son, and sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast, but they could not come. Again, he sent other servants, saying, tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. But they paid no attention and went off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. The king was angry, and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, the wedding feast is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main roads and invite to the wedding feast as many as you find. And those servants went out into the roads and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw there a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment? And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, bind him hand and foot and cast him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. Okay, so uh, like I said, I think these verses are pretty straightforward, but a few things to discuss here. So going again, this is a parable, so this is not something that happened in real life. This is a story and an account of that Jesus is saying to have people kind of understand the point that he's making. So first of all, who Jesus is referring to is to the Israelites. So of course we know that the king is the father and he is the son, right? So it's saying that the king is having a wedding feast for his son. And then it is understood that those that were invited are the Israelites. You know, these are his people. These are the people that God selected through Abram. Later Abraham. These are the people that God said, "You will be my people." These are the people that God gave the commandments. And therefore, these are the people that were initially intended to be the invitees or the guests to the wedding. So this parable, as Jesus is talking to the people, to the religious leaders, uh, he's talking about the Jewish people. And I'm going to do a quick pause there just to make sure that we understand. I think we've talked about this before, but I want you guys to remember that in this crowd, in the entire book of Matthew, and after Jesus, especially he gets back to Jerusalem, remember there's really three big groups of people. The religious leaders, right, that were looking to uh that hated him, right, and that were looking to trick him and to basically try to turn him in, try to trick him and everything he said. There was his followers, not only his disciples, but other people that had followed him, through his ministry and things like that. But there was a bunch of people that did not know who Jesus was, right? Remember, this was the time of the year where they came to Jerusalem and they came for the festivities. And it talks about people that came, basically Jews from around the world will go to Jerusalem at this time to celebrate. And actually, and I know we're going to talk about this in later chapters, but even the gentleman that carried the cross, if you go into the study and study his life, it said that he did not know who Jesus was when he was chosen to pick the cross. But the impact that Jesus had on him was so much that in the book of Acts, it talks about his sons that later were followers of Jesus. So, but that tells you that there's three groups of people here that Jesus is talking to. And I just want you guys to understand. So it's not just the religious leaders and followers, it's those main three groups of people. But Jesus here is talking about a parable that's talking to the Jews. So then what it's saying is that this king invited them to the wedding, and that basically they kept doing their jobs. They were uninterested, and basically they were not, they had no desire of going to the wedding that they were invited, right? So that was the attitude of the Israelites towards Jesus, towards the Son of God, right? So this is the parable that he's doing. And it also says that when they didn't come, not only were they uninterested, it also says that they killed the messengers that were invited them. And this is interesting because when you read this, uh, again, some people connected to them killing, them being the religious leaders and the Israelites killing people that were sent by God to deliver his message. So they talk about prophets. Specifically, they say that this parable, one person that Jesus perhaps had in mind was the baptizer, John the Baptizer. That he was the one that was before Jesus. He was the one that was intended to take the good news of the gospel and basically to prepare the way for Jesus. And he was killed, not necessarily through their hands, but they did the work behind the scenes to turn him into Herod, who later killed him, right? So it is understood that this is one of uh, the this is one of the parts of the message behind what Jesus is saying there, right? And then in verse 7, it's interesting because Jesus says that because they killed the prophets or the messengers, basically, it says that uh, basically he destroyed their city and burned their city. And up to this point, uh, that had not happened. A lot of people say that this is Jesus predicting or prophesying the burning of Jerusalem, which happened, I think, like 70 or 80 years after he said this. So there's a connection here where Jesus is both being prophetic, but is also rebuking or talking to the Israelites about their condition and how they have rejected the Son of God, right? So then, uh, bottom line there is that the guests were deemed unworthy because they basically did not want to come to the celebration, or they thought that they were uninterested. Okay. So the people of God, the ones he had declared as his people, were deemed unworthy because of their behavior. Okay. So that's basically the first verse, eight verses. So then when you go from 9 to 14, it's then he says, well, just invite everybody. So this is where we come into the picture, if you think about it, right? This is the analogy. Well, inviting everybody, opening up the invitation basically is the connection of the gospel going to the Gentiles, right? The Israelites, the people of God, rejected him and rejected basically his word. And when I say rejected his word, yeah, they talked his word, but they lived a different word than what they preached. So basically, their behavior was such that it implied that they were rejecting God because of what they were doing, right? And because of this, basically God said, okay, I'm going to open the invitation. I'm going to open it to everybody else. And it says that he opened it up to everybody else. And the verse specifically says that good and bad came. So because of their disobedience, because of their lack of interest, now there's an opportunity for us Gentiles to go in and celebrate the wedding of the son of the king, right? Now, which is good for us. But with that, verse 11 highlights one person, and I think this is important to talk about. So it says that there was one person that came, and when the king saw him, basically he said that he was not dressed appropriately, and that the king said, like, basically, why are you in here? How are you in here? How did you snuck in here, right? Basically, and then he is telling his servants to kind of bind them and throw him, and basically he is condemned. So if you think about it, so what does that represent? So that represents somebody that basically is not living according to the word of God, right? So these are people perhaps that have followed God, but have not followed along with his commandments with the way he wants us to behave, right? So basically, when the king tells them you're going to be thrown out because you do not look the par. Basically, what the king is representing there is that there are certain conditions, there are certain behaviors, there are certain uh, ways of us acting that I would say connect us with God and that make us participants of being in his wedding. So it's not just being invited, right? It's not just going to church every Sunday, I would say. There is a requisite, we need to live a life that is pleasing to God, right? It is not just a matter of getting in the wedding. It is not just a matter of going to Sunday. Basically, it's what are we doing with the word that we are learning? What are we doing with the word that we are listening to, right? What are we doing to show others that we are worthy to be invited to the wedding and that we are worthy to be in the presence of the king? Because at the end of the day, he is a king, right? At the end of the day, when you're in front of somebody of royalty, there's a certain behavior expected. So I think it's interesting when he opens this up to everybody, but even though he opens it up to everybody, there is a requirement for us to be in his presence. And that requirement is to live in accordance with his mandates, right? I think Romans says it perfectly when it says, those that basically follow my commandments are my sons, paraphrasing there, right? So it's interesting. So the disobedience and the uninterest of the Israelites opened the door for us. So now we are participating. We are participants. We are part of the wedding. But even that requires that we act a certain way, right? Even that requires that we live in accordance with the mandates and what God requires of us, so that not only we will be in the wedding, but we will also participate and be able to eat with him and enjoy the celebration. So those are the first 14 verses. So any comments or questions up to there? All right, we'll keep going. So verse 15, I'll go through verse 15 now through 22. And it says, then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words, and they sent their disciples to him, sorry, along with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax. And they brought him a denarius. And Jesus said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? They said, Caesar's. Then he said to them, Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And when they heard, they marveled, and they left him and went away. So again, I mentioned the three different groups here because I think these three groups are important so you understand what the religious leaders were trying to do and why Jesus answered them in the way he answered them. So I think in previous studies, we've talked about that initially his disciples, but also most of the Israelites were thinking of the Messiah coming to establish an earthly kingdom, not a heavenly kingdom, right? They they heard the prophecies, and when they think of the Messiah, the son of David, they think of the son of David doing the same thing that David did. If you guys remember when David was king, basically he beat everybody, right? If you look at the book of and Samuel and you look at the book of Kings, basically and I think even in Chronicles, it talks to you about what David did. I mean, they won every war, they beat every enemy. There was no doubt that the people of God were supported by God, and all their enemies were defeated. Right. So with that, knowing that they're under captivity, they're under the Roman reign, when they read all these prophecies, they're thinking, okay, the son of David is going to do the same thing. He's going to establish an earthly kingdom. They're going to overthrow Rome, and then we're going to reign and we're going to be victorious over all our enemies. That's the way they were thinking. Reality is, we all know that Jesus came to establish a heavenly kingdom, right? So when they're asking him this, they're asking not because they're interested in him giving taxes, but the malice in their minds and in their hearts is this. We're going to ask Jesus, we're going to ask this guy about taxes because one of two things is going to happen. If Jesus says that, no, you don't give taxes, right? They're going to accuse him with the Roman authorities. They're going to say, hey, here's this guy. He's trying to start a rebellion. He's telling people that they don't have to give taxes. And if you guys know, that's what Romans were all about, taxing people and trying to make a profit. So he probably would have been incarcerated and he would probably been put to death, right? So that was one of the kind of things that they thought was going to happen. But the other thing, again, talking about people following him and people that did not know him, but yet people that perhaps thought that he was going to establish a earthly kingdom. So then, if he says, "Well, yeah, you give Caesar a tax," then they're going to say, "Oh, this guy supports Rome. He can't be the Messiah, or he's not a true prophet. He supports Rome. How is he going to support a country that has us, under basically slavery or whatever you want to call it?" And then the people that followed him would perhaps no longer follow him because they were no longer going to be seeing him as a Messiah because they're going to see him as a sympathizer of Rome, right? So this was the intent of them asking the question, right? It was malice because they said, either way that you answer this, you're going to get in trouble. You're going to either get in trouble with Rome or you're going to get in trouble with all these people. They're going to stop following you, and then we're good because if they stop following you, they'll start following us again, and then we don't have to worry about you, right? So that's why they asked the question. But it's interesting because the way Jesus answered the question, I think also teaches us something important, right? That uh, we are to submit to all authorities, right? And I was as I was writing this, this is the way that I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about how sometimes us as Christians, and when we're teaching and we say different things, um, and I've heard many people say, well, we are of the kingdom of heaven, right? And like we're here, but we're of the kingdom of heaven, right? And uh, but I would say no, we belong to both kingdoms, right? So for example, we belong to the kingdom of heaven, but we are also part of the kingdom, if you want to call it that, of the United States. And what I mean by that is with that, and what Jesus is trying to tell them is that since you are part of both kingdoms, you have to give honor to both kingdoms, right? So what he's telling them is give Caesar his tax because if you are part of this kingdom, now talking about the United States, if you enjoy living in the roads, if you enjoy all the infrastructure that is here, right, then the way the United States gets to put that infrastructure in place is by taxing, right? You could disagree with it, right? But that is the way that you pay to enjoy all the infrastructure in the United States. You pay taxes, right? And if you don't want to pay taxes, then that's fine. You go somewhere else, but somewhere else you're going to have to pay taxes, right? Because any country you live in, you're going to have to pay taxes. So that's pretty much like bringing honor or kind of complying with the laws of that kingdom. But at the same time, we're the kingdom of heaven. So what does this mean? That means that we need to honor God with what is given to him, not necessarily monetary taxation, but it's with our soul. It's living in accordance with what he requires. So what God tells us first is that although you live in the United States, you need to honor your country, because that is what you do as a Christian to because you enjoy of all the things in this country, but you also need to honor me as your God with the way you live. This is the same message that Jesus gave the response when he said, give to Caesar what is a Caesar and give to God what is a God. What he was saying is, since you live in Rome, you're going to give Rome what they deserve or what they require. But you also need to give me what I require. So he's not saying one is better than the other, right? But what he's saying is you have to comply basically with both parties, right? So this is the answer that Jesus gives them. And in giving them this answer, you could see that, and like he doesn't fall in their trap. So he's telling them, give them, and he's explaining, but also by establishing that you need to give God what is God, he's establishing the priority of God in our lives, right? So, and I just wanted to put that out there because again, sometimes uh I feel that some of us use that as, oh, we're kingdom of heaven, and that gives us kind of like a way out, or like to disobey or to not do things that we're supposed to do. And that's not, God says that, and the Bible says that we need to comply with all regulations. We got to obey the leaders, right? So the right thing to do as a Christian is to submit to the laws of the country that you live in, in our case, United States. I'm not saying you have to agree with it. And if you don't agree, that's fine. That's a separate conversation. What I'm saying, the right thing is to comply with the laws. And I'll just again, and I think you guys know I try to use very simple examples, right? So you get August, tax time, favorite time of the year, right? So tax time, April 15th, taxes are due. Pick up the phone, call the IRS and say, you know what? I have a tax bill, but I'm a citizen of heaven. So see you next year. Just do that. Actually, no, don't do that. But I'm just saying, if you do that, what you think is going to happen? They're going to come for you, right? Because you're not doing your part to be part of the country, basically to pay your way to all the things you're enjoying. And to take it further, I don't think any of us will do that. You know why? Because we know there's repercussions. So the interesting thing is we wouldn't do it there, but we still do it with God to a certain point, so where God made the separation of country and God, and he made sure that they understood that they had to comply with both. I would say that one is mandatory and one is not, if you look at it from that perspective, right? Sometimes we see the laws of this nation as mandatory because there's a repercussion if we don't comply. If you don't pay your taxes, you'll go to jail. If you don't follow the laws, you go to jail, or whatever could happen, right? But sometimes it's easy to perhaps not obey God or not follow those rules because we don't see an immediate kind of impact, right? But I would say now go back up a few verses and go back to the go back to the wedding. What does it say? That if you're not found right, you're going to be thrown away, right? So, or basically taken out, right? So that is the repercussion if you don't do the latter. So if you don't do the first and you don't comply with the government, and you're going to be punished immediately, right? But if you don't comply with God and you don't do the things that honor him and you don't give him his tax, if you want to use it this way, there's going to be also repercussions. They're not going to be immediate, but they're going to be similar to what you read there. When it's the time of the wedding and when it's time that you think you're going to celebrate with the king, you're going to be thrown out. And when you're asking yourself, why were you thrown out? The answer is simple. You didn't pay your taxes, whatever taxes is. You didn't behave the way I told you to behave. You didn't follow my commandments. You didn't do unto others the way you want done to you, right? So it's real simple. So it's interesting, and again, you guys have heard me say this a lot. The Bible is not coincidental, right? Everything is connected. And this story of the taxes, there's a reason why it goes immediately after he's talking about, the wedding, right? Because the first one shows you what the repercussions are, if you don't comply with God. And the second one, like default, we know what the repercussions are if you don't comply with the earth, right? With the nation that you live in. So it's interesting what they intended to do, and you guys see kind of how he went around it. But the point here to understand is that the Bible tells us that we need to submit to all authorities, right? So let's be careful, and let's not become super spiritual and saying I'm a Christian, I'm a citizen of heaven, and I am only to obey God, right? Because there is some danger there, right? Because if 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 God controls everything, and if you believe that God is uh uh, over everything and has control over everything, that means that God has control over your job and your bosses and your boss's bosses and your neighbors and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So when you think that things are not going right and when you think that your boss is this and that he's not a man of God and that I'm going to choose to disobey all this other stuff, like take a step back and remember that if God puts everything in place and God allows everything, that boss that you have and that you perhaps feel that you don't have to obey or do all these other things, remember, God is in control and he is allowing it for a certain reason, right? So instead of saying, I'm not going to obey because I am a citizen of heaven and he is not in the authority because when I look at heaven, he is not between me and heaven. No, God placed him there. So we need to submit, as painful as it may be, right? Because although he talked about Caesar, the point there was the authority of the time and rendering the respect or the honor or the tribute that was required at the same time. So this is the same thing that is required out of all of us. Uh, and actually, it's funny, and I'm just going to say this. So I just I just heard that and I just said it and then I thought about and certain people I've talked about. So yeah, everything connected. So amen. Glory to God. So we're gonna keep going. So then it says verse 23 through I'll read 23 through 33, right? Actually, before I go there, and so I could take a sip of water. Any questions? 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's go. So verse 33, no, verse 23. It says, the same day Sadducees came to him who say that there is no resurrection, right? So they didn't believe in the resurrection. And they asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise us offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us, and basically saying, so the first married and died and had no offspring, the second and third. And so basically all 7 brothers died, and at one point, all 7 brothers were married to the same woman, right? So then in verse 28, it says, in the resurrection, therefore, of the 7, whose wife will she be? For they all had her. And then Jesus answered them, you are wrong because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. So this is interesting. He's talking to religious leaders and he's saying, you know neither the scriptures or the power of God, right? And then he says, for in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as far for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not God of the dead, but God of the living. And when the crowd heard it, they were astonished by his teaching or at his teaching. So, so like we said, first, Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection, but they're posing a question of the resurrection. So immediately you understand that what they're saying is to try to entrap him, right? Because they're asking him a question about something that they do not believe in, right? But they want him to give an answer, again, to try to find them in fault and try to use that as a pretense to either incarcerate them or anything else, right? So and we hear the story, right? But the thing about it is, so the 7 brothers and the wife, it's irrelevant, right? If you see it, Jesus ignores their entire question, but he focuses on one thing. So he says, and I'm going to read it in verse 32. He says, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. And then it says, he is not God of the dead, but God of the living. So Abraham, God, Isaac, and Jacob were dead, right? Physically, they were already dead. So if Jesus is talking about 3 people that are dead, the correct term is, I was the God of Abraham, I was the God of Isaac, and I was the God of Jacob, right? That's the word, that's the correct uh, verbiage to use, right? If your grammar is anything, especially if you know English and you know how the way words work together, right? But So why did Jesus say, I am the God of Abraham, I am the God of Isaac, and I am the God of Jacob? So Jesus uses this opportunity to talk to people that don't believe about the resurrection, to tell them that the resurrection is a true thing. And the way he uses it is by saying, I am the God of Abraham, of Jacob, and of Isaac. He's talking to them in present as if they were alive, because they were alive, not physically, but spiritually. So when Jesus is talking about this, what he's talking about them is the resurrection, right? And but he's doing it in a way to make them understand that he is the God of the living, and basically anybody that believes in him will live forever. That's the message behind it. He doesn't use these terms, but that's why I said it's interesting that if you pull back on the word of God, he says so much when you think that he says very little, right? So by saying those by saying that word and the saying using them in present instead of in past, basically what he is saying is that they are living, and by doing that, he is basically talking about the resurrection, and that in him and God, basically there is eternal life. That's the message that Jesus is telling them. And they understood it, right? And the reason I say they understood it, because it says that at the end, they were quiet, right? Why were they quiet, right? Because they understood that he's talking about the resurrection. That's one thing, right? And the second thing is, again, the way Jesus does this is very intentional, because he uses three individuals that are known as the patriarchs, as the basically the foundation of of the Israelites as a nation, right? So nobody was going to go in front of Jesus and argue that Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob were like either dead, or they were not going to say anything negative, right? So he purposely uses three people that he knows nobody's going to question him about, but at the same time, he uses it in a way to make them understand that the resurrection is a real thing, and that in him there will be resurrection, right? So, again, sometimes we don't see that when you read that, but the message that he uses is very is real deep, because he's letting them know of a principle that they did not believe in, how basically they did not understand the word. And that's why he tells them, you neither, like, you don't know the word nor the power of God, basically, because of the question they asked. And that's why he used the example he used to basically show them that everything they had learned was wrong. So the Sadducees, and just you didn't know, they basically believe the first five books of the Bible. That's it. So the books of the law, the first five books, everything else they didn't believe in, right? So that's where their mindset came, and that's why they didn't believe in resurrection and other things. So Jesus is using that as a basically is a teaching point to kind of expand their horizons. I think we all understand they probably didn't do it. They probably kept their ways because they were all about them and not about Jesus. But that's kind of why he focuses on the answer the way he did it. Okay. So then the last part, and like I said, I think this was going to be rather quickly. So uh uh it says, verse 34, but when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. He says, Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets, right? So only two things I want to highlight here. Uh, you guys have heard or have read this, all the law and the prophets, right? And basically, when the term they use that, or that the reason they use that term is, uh, if you consider the law and the prophets, that's the entire Old Testament, right? It was either written by a prophet or it was the books of the law, right? It's pretty simple. So when he tells them, or anytime Jesus answers and he says, of this depends the law and the prophets, what he's telling them is everything you understand, everything you have learned, everything you have heard about is based on these two commandments, right? So it's all encompassing, like he's leaving nothing out, right? So when you hear that he says law and the prophets, It encompasses everything they've known up to that point. But the second point is, uh, and and this is just something for you guys to think about, because I've heard many times when people hear that he says, uh, love God first above all, right? And then love your neighbor as yourself. That people say, well, those are the only two commandments. And then uh, as humans, we quickly try to dismiss everything else. So the other 10 commandments no matter. All these other things that happen in the Old Testament don't matter, right? We just do these two commandments. But if you step back and you think about it, by doing these two commandments, everything else that you learned has to be done, right? So just using the 10 commandments as an example, if you love your neighbor, then you can't commit murder. So it's not now that you ignore the Ten Commandments and you commit murder. No, it's that this is greater. Because if you consider God and if you consider your neighbor, then murder is not going to be in your mindset, right? And then you could take the Ten Commandments, and you could look at each and every one of them, and it's going to be the same thing. If you consider loving God and if you consider loving your neighbor, then those 10 things are not going to be in your mind, because they basically are fall underneath these two main principles, right? And then you could say that about any of the other laws that were in the Old Testament or any of the other teachings, right? So when Jesus is talking to them about this, again, they're trying to trap them, right? They're thinking about the Ten Commandments, and they're thinking about all these other commandments. I think there was like 500 commandments in the Old Testament, if not more, in addition to the Ten Commandments. So what they're thinking about here when they're asking these questions, again, is the same thing. They're going to ask him, and then they want him to say, well, the greatest commandment is murder. And if he says that, he says, well, what about this and what about that? Or if he says the greatest commandment is like, do not covet one's spouse or whatever. And they're going to say, well, what about this? What about that? Right. So again, the purpose for them asking is to try to entrap him. And his answer basically entraps them, because he just says, these are the two commandments. Everything that you've learned is based off of this. And secondly, by him saying this indirectly, they should feel a rebuke. Why? Because the way they behaved, we know that they did not care for their neighbor, right? We know that they did not love their neighbor. So by him putting these two conditions, right? Maybe they could have said, well, we love God over all things, but then they had to pause and they had to think about it. And they would have probably said, do I really love my neighbor as myself? And the answer is no. So again, the way Jesus is answering these is very interesting, because he's not trying to pick a fight with them. He's just answering it in a simple manner that tells them, and again, the groups of people that are around them, because it's not just the religious leaders, the way they need to behave, but it's also highlighting the way that they're not behaving, right? So he's using these answers as kind of correcting their behavior, but also showing them the way out, right? So that's what I like about Jesus's teachings. And this is something that I always say that something we should emulate. Because sometimes we're quick to judge, right? We're quick to point out a fault, but then we don't do the other part and just show people this is the way out, right? So, because Jesus always did that, right? Jesus always showed them kind of a way out or a better way, even if it was the answer to a parable or something, right? But Jesus not only was going to tell them, well, you're about to go to hell, right? But he would tell them, well, this is the way not to go to hell, right? I mean, because at the end of the day, he wanted everybody to be in the wedding, as we heard, right? To be invited, to be a guest. But because of their behaviors, we know that that didn't happen. Uh, so we're about to go to the last part. Any questions up to there? Hmm. Okay. Forgive me here. That just means I've been talking too much. So final stretch. So verse 41 through 46, it says, now while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question, saying, what do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? They said to him, the son of David. So he said to them, how is it then that David in the spirit calls him Lord, saying, then Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. If then David calls him Lord, how is he his son? And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from the day nor from that day, excuse me, did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. So what's interesting is that throughout this chapter, right, they're asking him questions, trying to trick him, and he's just giving them analogies and giving them stories and basically showing them how they're wrong and correcting kind of what their thinking is. But then he ends with a question, right? And he talks to them about David. And and the question, if you ask yourself, is so why is Jesus asking them this, right? Why does he have uh to 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 answer or to ask them about David, right? But because again, he wants them to understand who he is and kind of uh I would say assert or show that he is basically eternal or forever, right? If you think about it this way. So by talking about David, the son of David, because the Messiah is the son of David, right? So they made that connection. So then if everybody's calling him the Messiah, they're calling him, they know that he is from the lineage of David and then he is the son of David. But then they cannot see him as God because if he is from the lineage of David, that means he was after David. So the reason he's making this connection is to get them to understand that although the Messiah is coming from the lineage of David, he was before David. So basically, what he's doing here, he's giving them a tutorial of who he was. So he's telling them, like, physically, as a person, I come from the line of David, right? Basically, although he don't talk about himself, but he's talking about himself, right? I am from the line of David. I come from David, my father, mother, everything else. But basically, spiritually, what he's saying, I was before David. He's saying, I am God. I am the Messiah. And the Messiah was before David. That's why David refers to him as king. And then he's getting them to understand that who David referred to as king is the same person that was later going to come as a Messiah in person, right? So Jesus is talking about how he was going to come as a person, as a Messiah, and he is the one that David spoke about. So basically, he's connecting the dots of him being coming to earth, taking form, human form, becoming the Messiah. But they didn't, again, it went over the head. That's why it says that nobody would answer him. Because how are you going to answer that? If you think about that, sometimes I say it's interesting because uh, if you think about that question, like if somebody says, "Hey, I'm his son, but I was before him," or whatever, like what are you going to say to that? You're probably going to look at the person first. You're going to say, "Well, he's crazy," right? But these are religious leaders, and again, they understand, and they also know that if David is saying that, and it's the son of David, so in their mind, they're making the connection. Wow, that means that somebody from David is going to be the Messiah. But if David is talking to them about them being the Lord, that means they were before David. That means that person needs to be God, right? So as Jesus is asking them this question, they're thinking about all that stuff. And in their minds, because they were religious leaders, they probably made that connection. The son of David is the Messiah. The Messiah is God. And if this guy is the Messiah and he is from the lineage of David, this guy is God. They made that connection. But since their intent and their heart was to find them culpable, that's why they were silent. That's why they didn't want to say anything. Because anything they could say was, "You are the Messiah, you are the Son of God." But they weren't going to say that. So once they understood it in their mind, what did they do? They remained quiet. Why did they remain quiet? Because they were more interested in being right and having their positions than recognizing that Jesus was the Messiah, people following him, and them losing the authority and everything that they had on the earth. Okay, that's all I have for you guys today with the little bit of voice I have. So, any questions or comments? That just means that it was either clear or everybody's confused. One of the two. So I never asked, right? It's one of those two, and I'm not going to ask which one it is. So go ahead, Nikki.
Sorry. First of all, can you hear me? Okay. I wanted to say that was very well, very well executed, very clear and concise. Secondly, I didn't. I used to like read this at the end, and you know how you can just read a chapter, and then you kind of forget a certain part, and then you have to go back and go like, wait, what? Like it's like a circle of what they're saying. Thank you for putting it into the perspective of very simplistic terms to understand, because I would read that and yeah, I was like, okay, I understood why they didn't say anything anymore, because how I took it was when I would read it every time it would just be, yeah, he just gave them the right answers and they just shut up. But at the same time, you gave another perspective of like, these are religious leaders and they know the word and they know what it looks like if they start looking like outside to people, that it seems like they might question the word, and now other people are going to go, I don't know about these religious leaders. So it was like they were more worried about their stature and how they were perceived. And so that just kind of, thank you for that, because that was very very insightful. Also, I do, when you were talking about, um, like for the government, I thought it was very well put, because a scripture that came to mind for me was Isaiah 9:6, where it does talk about the government rests upon his shoulders. So it's like a lot of times people will be like, I'm not of this world. You hear that all the time. And they're like, I work for the Lord. I don't work for this company. And it's like, okay, God placed you in the company to be a light. Don't be a disturbance. Like, you are the light. You have to show the kingdom of heaven wherever you are. And God intentionally will place you where you're supposed to be. So it's like that perspective, that mindset is always the kingdom mindset. That is the kingdom of heaven. It's an upside down kingdom. And so, even the importance of the government, it was very important to the Lord. And for them to ask a question about taxes was technically a slap in the face, because in Isaiah 9:6, it already says the government rests upon his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, all these Prince of Peace. Like, so it's like you already know the word, and you're asking me this question and trying to box me in, and kind of, it's almost like, yeah, they even recognized who he was, but they didn't want it, they never wanted to acknowledge who he was. And so they kept trying to put him in a place where it makes him seem like he's just a man, and every single time he answered them correctly by the Spirit of the Lord. And so you can see that his answers were never like just flat out just from a place of the flesh. They were always from a place of wisdom. And he always said every single time, I'm going to say what my heavenly father says. I'm going to do what my heavenly father tells me to do. So it's like they kept trying to kind of pull him out of that, and then also question him with the word of God by those questions. So I just wanted to say this was really great. And thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And yeah, and it's interesting because like he doesn't have to tell them like I am the Messiah, I am the Son of God. And it's because of what Nikki said, because they knew the word. And by him just bringing bits and pieces, they should have connected everything and known that he was the Son of God. So this is why I would say that they're going to be judged harder than other people, right? Because they knew and yet they still did not believe and follow, right? So go ahead, Anthony. I got have you and then Miss Laura.
Yeah, for me, I just also want to like say this was very good how you broke everything down. Um, but for me, like really my favorite part is how Jesus he just handles like the situation with such grace, right? Like he lets everybody come to him and ask their questions, right? He never like dismisses them, turns them away, or like, hey, you can't question me. He like actually gives them an opportunity before he actually says what he says at the end and just shuts everything down, right? So for me, the way I look at it is it's almost like they're looking at him like they're these religious leaders and these teachers and everything, right? Almost like these scholars. And they're looking at this guy who has like no formal training, no formal education according to them, right? To me, it's like if a high school dropout goes to like Harvard and proves professors wrong, right? So I think it was like really a shell shock to them and just put them in their place. So like I said, I just love how he handled the whole situation.
Yeah, no, that's good. I kind of rewatched The Chosen not too long ago, and it's interesting because you're able to see some of those things, and like who is your rabbi? Like they're thinking he was taught by this guy, like who is this guy? But then they never question him because like they can't find any fault, so yeah, that's good. Go ahead, Miss Laura.
I was just gonna say this is really good. And I feel like very timely for me. I don't know if a lot of you know, but some of you know, I've been going through a lot of like custody cases and stuff like that with my kids. So the um some of the things that I've seen even within like the court system and stuff like that is so much injustice. But the Lord has been very like very strategic with me and like very gracious for me to like abide by the things that have been placed by men, even if it is like not just in his eyes. Like at the end of the day, he sees it, you know? And it's just good. Like it's a good lesson because we can't be rebellious and still call ourselves believers. Imagine if like we decide, oh, you know what, like you said, like if we decide not to pay taxes, I'm just gonna do, whatever I want because God's gonna pay for it. Like then we get the repercussions, but there's still consequences for it. Like it's very real. Um, but I've realized like even within like what I'm going through right now, God is very strategic and like he still gives instructions to like be able to get justice some way. He does do supernatural things and I have seen him do like supernatural things and I still have to testify about that. But um there has been certain things that I've been like, Lord, like, how is this fair? Or, how is it that we're like things like this can happen? And I'm sure I'm not the only one like this has happened to, multiple men and women. But my reassurance is like that the earth is his footstool. Like he is above it, regardless of, what the injustice that does occur in the world. Like he still sees it and there is gonna be, he's the judge above all judges. So even the like unlawful things that do occur or like injustice that does occur, there's still like eternal consequences for all of it. So yeah, this was good.
No, yeah, yeah, thanks for that, Laura. And what I would say is it's interesting because as you were saying that and I was thinking about this many times y- y- you know Jesus gave that instruction, but if you think about it, many times when things don't go our way is that we have disobeyed. And it's not that we disobeyed God. It's just we didn't comply with the things we're supposed to comply in the physical, right? And with the excuse of, like you said, we're pleasing God or because same as me, you guys haven't seen me at work at church for for like a lot of Sundays because I've been traveling for work, right? And I'm required to travel for work. So something as simple as like I'm not traveling. I got church. God is first, and God is first. But He gave me the job. I got to honor what I have to do. So you know, I know that that's required. So that's required, and so if I just say everything is God and I do that and dishonor, my bosses and everything else, God is not going to be pleased either, right? That's why he was clear of not saying honor me and don't honor Caesar, right? That's why he said give both what basically what they deserve, what they entitled to. And I would say, Laura, and in the case of many people, I think that's why things don't go the way they're supposed to go, right? Because we just focus on let me please God, but while you're pleasing God, you're treating your brethren the wrong way. You're not treating people with love. You're dishonoring your boss. You're doing all these other things. And that's just half of the equation, right? God
Yeah.
gave two commandments, and if you only obeying one, you're still in disobedience, right? So that's a good point, and thanks for that. But uh just for us to kind of remember that. So anything else? Any other comments? Alrighty then. So I'm going to stop the recording. And Anthony, again, I'm going to ask you to please pray us out so I could save the little bit of voice I have.
Of course.